Last week we learned about the desperate situation that the wise men of Babylon were in. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he was suspicious that the wise men would lie to him about its meaning. If they were able to tell him what his dream actually was, he thought then he could tell that their interpretation was true and right. This group of wise men included Daniel and his three friends, although they weren't there originally for the king's description of the challenge here. Upon learning about the danger, we learned that Daniel chose to respond wisely. We learned about his response of prayer, that God might spare them by revealing the dream to them, he and his three friends. We learned about his response of praise, when God made known to him the dream in a vision and its interpretation as a part of his poem of praise to the Lord. We came across these theme verses of our study of Daniel. And they're these. If I can get this to work. Thank you. Or not. There we go. From Daniel 2, verses 20 through 21. Back one. This isn't working. Was that me or was that you? Okay. All right. There we go. Daniel 2, verses 20 through 21 says this. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. We'll learn today just why these verses seem to sum up the theme of the book of Daniel. In them, God is lifted to his rightful place as a source of all wisdom and authority. In them, he is praised for being the one who sets up and removes kings and kingdoms and empires. We also learned about Daniel's response of proclamation as he stood before the king. It says, Daniel answered the king and said, in verses 27 through 28, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. Daniel's response reminds us that this setting is a contrast between the impotent efforts of the king's magicians and the omnipotent power of the God of heaven who reveals mysteries. We will see that God not only knows the future, he's also orchestrating the events of our world for Christ to reign forever. This is where we will pick up this morning as Daniel is standing in the king's court. He'll make known the king's dream as well as the framework for the coming centuries of empires. I remember hearing a story on the radio, and maybe heard it recently as well. It was about an actor who was a standing show at a theater. So every night he did a show, and he had all sorts of monologues and things as a part of the show. And he closed his show every night by repeating the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And continuing through the whole 23rd Psalm from memory. And it was always kind of a somber close to the night and very dramatic. One particular night, as he was closing and the crowd knew and could anticipate that this is how he would always close his shows, an older man in the congregation simply raised his hand, and as he was acknowledged him, and he asked, do you mind if I close the night with the 23rd Psalm? And so he thought, sure, that would be fine. And so this older man moves up slowly to the stage and begins to recite this from memory. As the actor is watching, he sees person after person beginning to weep in the crowd, and this is amazing to him. He's thinking, I haven't gotten people to weep ever. That's like my dream. And later he asks the man, he says, how is it that you did this? What did you add? What is it about what you do with this psalm? And he said, it's very simple. You know the psalm, I know the shepherd. You know the psalm, but I know the shepherd. And we see this as Daniel is standing before the king. We see in his words, and you can picture this in his demeanor, King, I'm going to make known to you the truth, but I know the God who has revealed the truth to you. And we see this in the confidence that he shows. Daniel stands before the king not just as a person who knows the dream and its interpretation. He stands there as the man who knows the God of the dream. So let's walk through Daniel 3, starting at verse 29. We see in verses 29 through 30 the purpose of the king's dream. It says, to you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for you, this mystery has been revealed to me. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have, more than all of the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Notice in verse 29 that Daniel recognizes that Nebuchadnezzar's dream is prophetic. It points to what is to come. Again, Daniel's clearly trying to explain how it was not by any wisdom of his own that he learned the dream. In fact, he makes a point to say, it was revealed to me. And it's interesting how the wording here, it doesn't show up very well in the ESV, but he's saying, basically he's saying, as for you, these thoughts and these mysteries came to you. As for me, the interpretation was only revealed to me. It's the same words, as for you, but as for me. And really, he's saying, I didn't discern this. I didn't conjure this up. I don't have some sort of power that manipulated this out of God. He chose to reveal it to me, not wanting to take the glory. So we move into verses 31 through 35, which is the king's dream. And here we see, he says, you saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. He says the head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. There's no record that we have of a statue like this being built, or statues like this of different metals progressing, being built in ancient times. Still, there was a practice, though, of describing eras or empires in terms of values of metal, or in terms of precious metal, and oftentimes of declining value. This is a figurative description, of history. It was utilized even as early as 200 years prior to this, as early as 800 BC. So we can assume that the king had some sort of idea that his dream was describing the passing of eras, the passing of times. And something very curious happens next in his dream. So it must have especially given the king some sort of concern. He says, as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand. And it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. Notice that Daniel makes the point to mention that this stone was not cut out by any human hands. I find that interesting because oftentimes in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Isaiah, God will mock the idolaters of that time to say, what you're worshiping, it used to be a block of wood. And then just a human decided to carve it out. Or you just took a stone and chiseled it into something. Now you bow down to it. I think it's significant that he says a stone was cut out, but not by human hands, pointing to the divine nature of this emissary of God in his dream. And the work of that stone is destructive and awesome. And any might or glory that this statue had was nothing compared to the work of this stone. You know, when you see a combine in the field, oftentimes as it's going through and harvesting, from the back of that you'll see a cloud kind of going out. And if the wind's blowing, it might even blow that cloud across the road or for a few hundred yards or so. And what this cloud is made up of is just the tiny bits and shreds of plant material that's good for nothing, other than just let it fall on the ground and soak back into the soil and dissolve. This is the chaff, part of this, especially the light stuff that's coming out. It's the chaff blowing out of the back of this combine. And this statue, after the destruction of this stone, is described as the whole thing being disintegrated into chaff and just blown away by the wind until none of it can be found. And Daniel continues, but the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Just in case this story is new to you, or just to give you a preview, this stone is Christ. It's the Messiah, the one whose kingdom will fill the whole earth. And I just can't wait till later in the message to say that. But while the image of this statue was frighteningly massive and glorious, that was nothing. The stone grows into a mountain. And it doesn't become a mountain, just a mountain that dwarfs this image. It grows to the point of filling the whole earth. That like there's nothing on the earth that exists that's plant material or rock or anything like that in this picture. It's just that mountain that has consumed it. So at this point, Daniel has told the king nothing new, right? This is his own dream that he's telling. But in order for the king to know the interpretation was sure, remember, he wanted someone to tell him, what did I dream? So Daniel satisfied the requirements of the king, and you can picture the king waiting for the interpretation, sitting on the edge of his throne, if you will. So verses 36 through 45 get into the interpretation of the dream. It says, this was the dream, now we will tell you, the king, its interpretation. I would assume this means he has his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, standing next to him. He says, you, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the air, of the heavens, making you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. You know, at first when I read the way Daniel addressed the king, I was a little confused. We often hear of King of Kings as being a title of Christ. But notice what Daniel adds to the title with which he addresses the king. He describes him as being the one to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory that he has. Daniel's standing before one of the most powerful men the world will ever see. Still, his commitment and conviction causes him to address the king rightly. He describes all of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom and power and might and glory and dominion as having come from the God of heaven. informs King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. Notice as we read that the other parts of the statue, they're described as kingdoms that will come, but the head is described as Nebuchadnezzar himself. We'll talk more about the glory of Babylon as we get into chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar took pride over as he looked over it. But for now, understand that there had never before been a city like it up to this point. The city and the Babylonian Empire quickly grew to the height of its glory under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. As mentioned, describing kingdoms in terms of precious metals was known of at that time. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he would have been pleased to hear that that head of gold, that was obviously the pinnacle of this statue of value and as well as being on top of it, he would have been pleased to hear that this was he himself. So Daniel continues. It says, after another kingdom inferior to you shall rise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. So what we have here is the framework for much of the prophecies of the book of Daniel. If you look on the back of your bulletin there, you'll see a chart. And just this chart is only filled out in terms of chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. But as we move into different visions and prophecies of the book of Daniel, we'll fill in other things here. But we're given the framework here of that. Two things I want to point out. As you look at the dates of these empires were being described in relationship to ruling over the nation of Israel. Okay? When he talks about the empire ruling over the whole earth, it's talking about that whole earth area in relationship to Israel. At this time in history, see if I can say this right, the Zhou dynasty would be ruling in China. But has no relationship to Israel at that point, so it's no part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and such. It's in a sense not considered a part of the known world. But the Chinese dynasties date back into 3,000 years BC. So we're talking in relationship to the nation of Israel here. Also, the quality of the metals of the statue, I want to say, more represent the cultural effectiveness of the empire. You can see that real simply by their description of power or reach. Notice the Babylonian Empire lasted only 86 years. The Medo-Persian Empire, as you see from the dates, it lasted 208 years. The Greek Empire, 268. And the Roman Empire lasted as much as 539 years. You'd think that the Romans would have been considered the Golden Empire if we're just talking about their length of time and the reach that they had. But I believe the value of the metals represent the quality of their culture, not the godliness of their culture, but the quality of their culture and the effectiveness of their rule. Nebuchadnezzar was better known for winning over the hearts and minds of the people that he conquered. Again, we'll talk more about his glory and the glory of the nation, the empire and the city of Babylon in chapter 4. But let's move into some observations of these verses that we have before us. He says, another kingdom inferior to you shall rise after you. The Medo-Persians, as we will better understand as we move into chapter 7, where Daniel's vision is very specific about what the next nation to take over would be. The Medo-Persians function more on the basis of political appointment and the establishment of laws of the land, which we would think of as a good thing in our Western culture. But it was an ineffective, not nearly as effective of a rule as what Nebuchadnezzar had set up and was carrying out. These laws bound everyone, even the king of the Persians. In chapter 6, we'll see how the politics of the Medo-Persians placed Daniel in grave danger. Also, the Medo-Persians were first to make use of taxes and tributes across the board with everyone that they ruled in their provinces of their territory. These tributes were paid in silver, which also points to the metal of their portion of the statue, those silver arms. It says, and yet a third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over all the earth. The Greek Empire covered great territory with military swiftness led by Alexander the Great. But the empire broke apart quickly by the 4 squabbling generals shortly after Alexander's death. Interestingly, the Greeks were the first to make use of bronze in their armor and in their weapons. This moves us to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire came on the scene just 63 years or so before the birth of Christ. Its military strength and taxation is summed up best by one word: crushing. You can see how quickly these kingdoms that follow Nebuchadnezzar are poorer in their cultural quality, relying more on military strength, developing more political snafus and traps in their government system. This is the case even though they might have been stronger and larger and longer lasting. But this brings us to the 5th kingdom. Keep this in mind in terms of, okay, so the quality is degrading as their system of government becomes more beset with problems and dependent on military strength maybe or taxation of their people. And so he says, as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. When it comes to understanding the feet made of iron and the clay, there's certainly lots of different opinions about this, and we're not given specific interpretation here. Any understanding needs to be held loosely and given a clear, since we're not given a clear interpretation, as I said. But we can observe what we're told, that this mixture makes for a weak empire. It makes for a weak kingdom. It's certainly the least valuable portion of the statue, if it has any value at all. Its usefulness is definitely hindered by what it's made up of. Both iron and clay are useful, but notice in each of their refining process, the other is removed. If you're going to refine it down. Smelting iron is done to remove impurities like clay. The presence of clay would harm the quality and the strength of the iron. As well, a potter who's forming a pot is going to carefully remove any hard pieces like a piece of iron would be in a pot that he's forming. A piece of iron mixed in with a piece of pottery would destroy it. It would make it useless. There's also no way to mix the two of them. If you were to melt them down together and pour them into a crucible, once it cooled, they would still be completely separate. It's not like you'd end up with this iron-clay alloy or something like that. It'd be still be completely separate and brittle. The picture painted here is one of weakness and futility. There are certainly different views of the feet, as I mentioned, but my present opinion might change 10 years from now. But just to, so take this for what it's worth. My present opinion is that this represents the Western world. I do believe that this kingdom is in place in the end times, but I don't necessarily think that this statue, that there's this gap between the legs of iron and the feet of clay. I believe the statue kind of teaches one flows into the other. I believe that what we see here is the rule of this kingdom in the West. I believe we are seeing the rule of this kingdom in the Western world. It's disseminated across many nations. I'm not talking like some sort of conspiracy or something like that. But let me read to you what one commentator has to say on them. We're good. Great. Says the Roman Empire outwardly would disappear, but its laws, its philosophies, and institutions would continue until this very day, taking us down to the feet of clay. Those who hold this view have different opinions about what the iron represents and what the clay represents, but some, including Charles Swindoll, believe that the iron is the last semblance of a functioning government, and the clay mixed with it is the will of the public, which weakens the mixture. Think of how many nations in Europe are sinking financially, but yet their people are rioting in the streets, not wanting any of their benefits to be revoked. Or how about politicians, and even in our own country, that buy votes from their constituents with promises to the point that we are at a nanny state almost. We hang over a fiscal cliff, but no one wants the benefit that affects them to be removed. Take what the other guy cares about, not what I care about. This quote is attributed to different sources, but it's definitely from the early 1800s, that says a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the majority discovers it can vote itself money out of the public treasury. After that, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits, with the result that democracy collapses because of loose fiscal policy. This from the early 1800s. Is that not what we're seeing? Warren Wiersbe, he sees this mix as being the will of human nature weakening the rule of law. He says when you come to the iron and clay, you have our present governments. The iron represents law and justice. The clay represents mankind. And together they make up democracy. What is the strength of democracy? Law that rules even those who are in authority. What is its weakness? Human nature. We are seeing today that lawlessness comes when human nature refuses to be bound by God's order and laws. Is human nature always a bad thing? No. Is clay always a bad thing? No. Is law always a bad thing? No. Iron's not a bad thing. No. You mix the two of them together. And I believe that's what we're seeing. And this makes sense to me as well as we watch our justices decide what is just based on legal precedents. This is the belief that what is right actually evolves. What is just actually evolves. And when one court declares something to be right and just, the others must do the same. Do the law allow it for somewhere else? I guess we'll have to declare it to be right here as well. I'm thinking that God foresaw the times that we're living in. Just when you're thinking, stop the madness, I want to get off this merry-go-round, I want to just buy some land out in Idaho, right? The stone comes and strikes the feet. Notice that? It strikes what? The feet. And it's blown to bits and blows away in the wind. So this brings us to the stone which was divinely cut out and crushes the statue of the kingdoms of man. God gave Daniel this interpretation as well. He says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. Notice when this is to take place. He says, we see in the dream that it strikes the feet, but he makes mention in the days of those kings. Remember, this isn't referring to the rulers of those empires. It's referring to the toes of the feet. We'll see later in Daniel that 10 different things are representative of 10 kings that will be in place somehow when this stone strikes. The destruction of these kingdoms will take place in the end times, after the rapture of the church and the tribulation period. And we'll get to look into that more later in Daniel as well, as we fill in this framework that we're given. Daniel will take us much more into some of these details, as I said, but the mixture of the iron and the clay is the kingdom that is ruling during the end times, and I believe we're seeing it in effect today in philosophy and things like that, in basically the lowering of the quality of the governing systems that we see around us. But we certainly see it at work today, as I mentioned. The kingdom that God will set up is not going to be like any kingdoms of man. Notice what Daniel says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. First, it will not be destroyed. And second, it will not pass to another ruler, even of the same family. We'll see in chapter 5 of Daniel just how quickly the glory of Nebuchadnezzar was lost on his grandson Belshazzar. But God's kingdom will always have him as its ruler. He interprets the dream again and says, it shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. What does it mean that it'll break all these kingdoms? Even Babylon, which will have come and gone. So meaning, the feet are what is at rule at that point, that the stone comes and breaks it. But remember, he described that all of the kingdoms would shatter and blow away. I think this is talking about that their influence will be removed from the earth completely. You're talking about a culture on the earth without any residue of the cultures previous to it. Anybody ready for that? God's ways and God's culture will be all that is practiced. And Daniel closes this interpretation, says, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. This moves us into verses 46 through 49, where he says, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. A couple observations here. The king was certainly impressed, but he still didn't get it. Some of you kids are familiar with Pokemon, or maybe that's even too old. Adults are familiar with collecting baseball cards and things like that. Understand that at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, he was trying to do whatever he could to capture the wisdom and the might of Daniel's God for himself. for his rule, to further his kingdom. Like getting, the best Pokemon character or the best baseball card that you've been looking for. His pantheistic view only allowed him to think that he was in the presence of the prophet of a great God. And so that's what he's doing here. He couldn't see that Daniel represented the only God. And that's what we'll see after the holidays, that right into Daniel 3, what does he do? He goes and sets up a golden statue of himself. Well, I'm the king of gold, aren't I? Let me say, and it continues, then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him rule over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So Daniel grabbed those who he could trust. He grabbed his prayer partners. He grabbed his accountability brothers to help him carry out. He knew that he was not necessarily up to this. And note, I want you to realize that these things fell off Daniel. This recognition, this approval, this honoring, it fell off Daniel. Why? Because he had been in the Lord's presence. He treasured the Lord. He treasured his God more than all these things. He's looking at this and thinking, great, Babylonian, honors. You guys are out of here pretty soon. One day, what good is this stuff? I want to follow that stone. I want to follow that rock that becomes the whole earth. The way that we allow temptation and trials and honors to fall off of us is to treasure God more than those things. So I was recently introduced to a show called Duck Dynasty. And it's funny to watch these guys work together, all of them looking like Grizzly Adams. In fact, one of the brothers on the show, he's mentioned that the Christmas season for him is about three things: faith, family, and facial hair. We're going to draw two eternal principles out of Daniel 2. Daniel 2 for harvest. At Christmas, we celebrate the birth of the King of Kings, who is carrying out God's sovereign plan for the earth. One person writes, Daniel's visions can be understood up to a point, but cannot be completely understood in all details. They are specifically designed to communicate mystery. They leave us uncertain about specifics, even though they clearly tell us that God is in control. And that's God's point in them. Our first principle from this is God is sovereign over the empires of man. Reminder from Daniel 2, 20 through 21. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Can you see why now, after receiving from the Lord the dream and its interpretation, why this is Daniel's response? Talking about God changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He is the source of it all. He's behind it all. He's in it all. He's orchestrating it all. I'd assume that you're picking up on this already, but God is not just telling Daniel the future to Daniel and the king. He's showing himself as being in complete and utter control over the kingdoms of mankind. Another quote here is that he says, a writer says, it is really God, not Nebuchadnezzar, who is behind the Babylonians' assertion of power over Judah. It's God Not Nebuchadnezzar and his education, who's behind the extraordinary skills of Daniel and his three friends. It's God who's behind Daniel's ability to penetrate the secret of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then describing the book of Daniel itself, he says, each chapter tells a different story, but each one is a story of divine sovereignty. That's why we title our time in Daniel, The Supreme Rule of God in an Ungodly World. Romans 13 tells it to us this way. It says, oh, and I'm sorry here. There you go. Romans 13:1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So even with our talk about the impotence and the inability, it seems, of governing systems in the Western world to work without corruption and without being swayed by the will of the people and things like that, in terms of giving people things. Even with that, we're reminded by Romans that this institution of whatever government we're under is established by God. And he has a purpose in it. You know, a few years ago, there was a show advertised called The Event. It was something, the event was supposed to be something that was going to happen, and it was going to change everything. I never watched it because I got to go so sick of the commercials not telling me what the event was that I was like, forget it. I don't have any interest in it. But I want you to take heart. During our day, the next great divine event is being set up to take place. At any moment, Christ's followers, we will be gone with him. He's going to return, and he's going to call us to himself, and we will meet him together in the air. And if I can say it this way, God is lacing up his bowling shoes to roll a perfect strike with his stone. The man of his choosing is his Son, Jesus Christ, the stone which the builders rejected. There is no aspect of our lives that God is not interested in and involved with for his glory. We are right in the middle of his plan of Daniel 2. Our very moment in history is foretold, and if you are frustrated by how it seems like nothing can get done, remember that God told us it would be so. He told us the present kingdom would be weak and mixed up. If you're like me, you heard on Friday about this horrible killing of 20 children. And you ask yourself, how can something like this happen? What can be so screwy about someone to want to do this, to think about doing this? I was driving home, knowing that, Kelly's homeschooling and hasn't listened to the radio or the TV or anything like that, and knowing that I'm going to need to, tell her about this. And my heart is just burdened with this. And it's like a weight. And as I walk through the door, there's Christmas music playing in the kitchen. And on the CD player was the song, O Come, Emmanuel. And it was in the middle of the second verse where it says, O come, thou dayspring, come and cheer our hearts by thine advent here. And then I heard these words, disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. And at that moment, I had this sense that I've never had before of this is what it was like to wait for the Messiah. our Emmanuel. I realized that Jesus, God's stone of destruction, was coming one day to make all things right. This moves us to our second and final principle here from our passage. Jesus is the final king of all kings. The final king of all kings. Paul describes him in this way to Timothy in 1 Timothy 6. He who is blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings, the only sovereign, the King of kings and Lord of lords. In the predicted moment of his toppling the kingdoms of man, it's said in Revelation 17, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. So any lords or kings that will be making war on him, he will step forward as, I am your king. I am your Lord. At Christmas, we celebrate the one who is the stone, which will one day obliterate the kingdoms of the earth. One of the hardest things for us to comprehend is why and how it was that he came as a baby. Why and how? But we're foretold in Isaiah around this same time of Daniel, in Isaiah 9, 6 through 7. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulders. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. That stone that destroyed the statue and grew to the point that it consumed the whole earth. And what Daniel said, that kingdom will have no end. It will be forevermore, and it will be never given to another people. That is the kingdom of the child that is promised by Isaiah 9, and that's the child that we celebrate. It's said that the world has been entirely at peace only 8% of the time since history has been recorded. 8%. History's been recorded for 3,100 years. Only 286 years have been warless, and 8,000 treaties have been broken during this time. 286 out of 3,100. Jesus' reign will be one of the Prince of Peace, and it will be for forever. The kingdom of this child will last forever and ever. But what did he do in the meantime? Why the hard life and the horrible death on earth? To be resurrected by his own power. Why not just take his throne in the time of Daniel and rule forever? This is to me the most amazing part of this. In the meantime, between Daniel and the end, he came to redeem a people for himself. He came to redeem those who would rule with him one day. Just give you a snapshot of Daniel 7:27, where we'll eventually see and go with this. It says, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. This is describing that day. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and his dominions shall serve and obey him. Unbelievable to me that his kingdom, it won't be given in terms of what is his given to us. But Daniel foretells us as well that even out of the tribulation and the trials and the challenges that we face, that we can look toward the day that those that he has redeemed will rule with him. Amazing to me. So by admitting that we are sinners, that we don't deserve that place, that we are in need of accepting the person and work of Jesus Christ for our salvation, we get to ride on his coattails. I think that this is what allowed Daniel to stand in the court of the highest ruler of earth. It should allow us as followers of Christ to stand wherever that he puts us, especially during this Christmas season. Everything around us. Let it remind you that this one who came as a child came to rule. And he came to redeem a people that would stand by him, that would be given him a position under him. Amazing.